what government does and why it matters. Economic inequality is a growing gap in income between the very rich Americans and everyone else. Is a striking condition of contemporary America. In fact, economic inequality in the United States is the highest it has been since 1928. Political scientist Larry Bartels has shown that the gap between the super rich and everyone else has increased since the 1980s and continues to grow. Between 1993 and 2012, the income of the top 1% of Americans grew 86%, while the income of the other 99% grew less than 7%. The median household income of Americans has remained about the same for nearly a decade. The United States has some of the highest economic inequality in the world. Are Americans are Americans aware of this growing economic inequality, and what do they think about it? Public opinion polls can offer an answer. Polls show that the public attitudes towards growing income inequality has remained mostly unchanged since the 1980s. Less than half of Americans, 47%, thought the gap between the rich and the poor was a serious problem in 2013. Furthermore, partisanship appears to have a big effect on people's opinion. While 92% of Democrats agree with the statement today, it's really true that rich just get richer and the poor gets poorer. Just 56% of Republicans agree with the statement. The social class of the respondent also shapes public opinion. Social class of the respondents also shapes public opinion. Of those who describe themselves as lower class, 84% agree that the rich are getting richer, compared with 66% of those in the upper class. Those in the upper class also reported being more satisfied and happier. What does public opinion on inequality means for American politics? If many Americans are unaware that income inequality is growing, then they may not demand different policies, such as increase in the minimum wage or increase government taxation on the wealthy to support government assistance for the poor. Informed public opinion is crucial in order for citizens to have their preferences heard by elected officials. Low levels of political interest or knowledge may be one reason Americans disagree about the fundamental aspect of social and economic condition. In the first 4 chapters, we have examined the development of American government. With this chapter, we turn to American politics as it operates in society. We begin with public opinion. Public opinion represents attitudes about politics. Define public opinion and identify broad types of values and beliefs Americans have about politics. The term public opinion refers to attitudes citizens have about political issues, leaders, institutions, and events. It is useful to distinguish between values and beliefs on the one hand and attitude and opinions on the other. Values or beliefs are the basic principles that shape a person's opinions about political issues and events. They constitute a person's basic orientation to politics. Values underlie deep-rooted goals, aspirations, and ideals that shape an individual's perception of political issues and events. Liberty, equality of opportunity, and democracy, for example, are basic political values held by most Americans. An attitude or opinion is a specific preference on a particular issue. An individual may have an attitude toward American policy in the Middle East or an opinion about economic inequality in America. The attitude or opinion may have emerged from a broad belief about the purpose of military intervention or about the role of government in the economy. But the opinion itself is very, very specific. Some attitudes may be short-lived and can change based on changing circumstances or new information. Factors such as race, gender, income, age, religion, and region, which not only affect individuals' interests but also shape their experiences and bringing influence Americans and upbringing influence Americans' beliefs and opinions. For example, individuals whose income differs substantially have correspondingly different views on the desirability of any number of important economic and social programs. In general, the poor, who are the chief beneficiary of these programs, support them more strongly than do those who are wealthier and pay more of the taxes that fund the programs. Blacks and whites have different views on issues that touch upon civil rights and race relations, such as affirmative action, presumably reflecting differences of interests and historical experiences. In recent years, many observers have begun to take note of various differences between the views expressed by men and those expressed by women, especially on foreign policy questions, where women appear to be much more concerned with the dangers of war. Political attitudes are also strongly influenced by partisanship, Republicans versus Democrats, and ideology, conservative versus liberals. Opinions about issues in politics have emotional underpinnings as well. Opinions about issues and politics have emotional underpinnings as well. Emotional responses to candidates or policies run the gamut from strongly positive to strongly negative, and these emotions are traditionally measured by survey questions asking if a candidate or individual, event, or issue make the respondent feel fearful, anxious, angry, or enthusiastic. Contrary to the idea that public opinion is purely rational, feelings are complicated and often irrational. Once individuals become emotionally attached to a particular belief, they tend to hold on to those beliefs even in the face of contradictory information. Also, emotions as a guide, individuals form opinions quickly in response to current events. As an example, during Obama's first presidential term, about 20% of Americans believed that he had been born outside the United States and thus, as a non citizen, was ineligible for the presidency. Among Republicans, those doubting the president's citizenship numbered more than 2 in 5. This belief persisted even as the verified details of Obama's personal life were widely available and included ample evidence of his American citizenship. To counter the widespread misperception, the White House eventually posted to the internet a photo of President Obama's long-form birth certificate showing that he was born in a hospital in Honolulu, Hawaii on August 4th, 1961 at 7:24 p.m. Never in history has a sitting president been forced to prove his citizenship publicly. Americans share common political values. Most Americans share a common set of values, including a belief in a principle, if not always the actual practice, of liberty, equality, and democracy. The United States was founded on the principle of individual liberty. Americans have always voiced strong support for the idea of liberty and typically support the notion that governmental interference in individuals' lives and property should be kept to a minimum. Although in recent years, Americans have grown accustomed to greater levels of governmental intervention than would have been deemed acceptable by the founders of liberal theory. Similarly, equality of opportunity has always been an important theme in American society. Most Americans believe that all individuals should be allowed to seek personal and material access. Moreover, Americans generally believe that such success should be the result of individual efforts and ability rather than family connections or other forms of special privileges. Equality, public education, is one of the most important mechanisms for obtaining equality of opportunity, in that it allows individuals, regardless of personnel or family wealth, a chance to get ahead. Today, the internet is emerging as an important example of equality of opportunity by providing online access to news, politics, jobs, and other benefits of digital citizenship. Economic opportunity, defined as a good job and a decent standard of living, is a core value in American politics. Most Americans also believe in democracy. They believe that every citizen should have the opportunity to take part in the nation's governmental and policy-making process, and to have some say in determining how he or she is governed, including the right to vote in elections. Obviously, obviously, the principles that Americans espouse have not always been put into practice. For 200 years, Americans embraced the principle of individual liberty and equality of opportunity while denying them in practice to generations of African Americans. Yet the strength of the principles ultimately helped overcome practices that deviated from those principles. America's dominant political ideologies are liberalism and conservatism. America's dominant political ideologies are the dominant political ideology of America is liberalism and conservatism. As we noted in the previous section, Americans share broadly in their fundamental political values. However, the application of these values to specific policies varies quite a bit. The set of underlying orientations, ideas, and beliefs through which we come to understand and interpret politics is called a political ideology. The set of underlying orientations, ideas, and beliefs through which we come to understand and interpret politics is called a political ideology. In America today, a variety of ideologies compete for attention and support, but two are dominant: liberalism and conservatism. In classical political theory, a liberal was someone who favored individual initiatives and was suspicious of governments and their ability to manage economic and social affairs. A definition akin to that of today's libertarian. The proponent of a larger and more active government called themselves progressive. The proponent of a larger and more active government called themselves progressive. In the early 20th century, many liberals and progressive coalesced around the doctrine of social liberalism, which represent recognition that government actions might be needed to preserve individual liberty. Today's liberals are social liberals rather than classical liberals. In contemporary politics, being liberal has come to imply supporting political and social reform, extensive government intervention in the economy, the expansion of federal social services, more vigorous efforts on behalf of the poor, minorities, and women, and greater concern for consumers and the environment. Liberals generally support abortion rights and rights for gays and lesbians, and are concerned with protecting the rights of people accused of crimes. Liberals oppose state involvement in religious institutions and state sanction of religious expression. In international affairs, liberals often support armed control, aid to poor nations, and international organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union. Liberals generally oppose the development of testing of nuclear weapons and the use of the American troops to influence the affairs of developing nations. Many liberals are opposed to military wars. Conservatism. By contrast, conservatives generally support the social and economic status quo and are suspicious of efforts to introduce new political formula and economic arrangements. They believe strongly that a large and powerful government poses a threat to the freedom of individual citizens. Ironically, today's conservatives espouse the views of classical liberalism. Today, in the domestic arena, conservatives generally oppose the expansion of governmental activity, asserting that solutions to social and economic problems can and should be developed in the private sector. Conservatives particularly oppose efforts to impose government regulation on businesses, maintain that regulations frequently leads to economic efficiency, is costly, and can ultimately lower the entire nation's standard of living. In terms of social policy, many conservatives support school prayer and traditional family arrangements and are concerned about law and order. Conservatives generally oppose abortion, same-sex marriage, and the use of mandatory school busings to achieve the racial integration of schools. In international affairs, conservatism has come to mean support for military intervention and the maintenance of American military power. Mixing ideologies. Both liberalism and conservatism are far from monolithic ideologies, and until recently, most Americans consider themselves moderates with shades of liberal and conservative values. Many conservatives support at least some government social programs, and many liberals favor strong national defense or oppose government regulations. Figure 5.2 shows that the percentage of Americans who consider themselves moderates, liberals, or conservatives have remained relatively constant for the past 15 years. Pew surveys indicate that as of 2012, 39% of Americans consider themselves conservatives, 37% moderate, and 23% liberals. These numbers have remained virtually unchanged since the 1990s. Americans exhibit low trust in government. One of the most important measures of public opinion in a democracy is trust in government. High levels of political trust create legitimacy for democratic government, whereas very low levels can cause concerns. Many scholars and political pundits argue that Americans are becoming more and more disenchanted with traditional political institutions. Public approval of Congress reached a low of only 10% in 2014. Critical citizens are characterized by high expectations of democracy as an ideal and yet low evaluation of the actual performance of government. Why does public opinion in the form of trust matter? Declining trust has been linked to declines in political participation and voting. Low confidence in government and elected officials is related to the perception that the government is unable to solve problems, spend money in an effective or efficient way, or represent the interests and policies preferences of average voters. The Pew Research Center has tracked trust in the federal government from 1958 to 2013 by asking this question on national surveys. How much of the time do you trust the government in Washington? The percentage of Americans who indicate they trust the government just about always or most of the time has fallen from 73% in 1960s to just 19% in 2013. These trends span party lines. In 2013, only 10% of Republicans indicated they trusted government some or all of the time, compared with 17% of independents and 28% of Democrats. When Republicans hold the White House, slightly more Republicans trust government than Democrats. Political socialization shapes public opinion. Explain the major factor that shapes specific individual opinions. People's attitudes about political issues and elected officials tend to be shaped by underlying political beliefs and values. For example, an individual who has negative feelings about government intervention in America's economy and society would probably oppose the development of new social and healthcare programs. Similarly, someone who distrusts the military would likely be suspicious of any call for us to use U.S. troops. The processes through which these underlying political beliefs and values are formed are collectively called political socialization. Probably no nation, and certainly no democracy, could survive if its citizens did not share some fundamental beliefs. If Americans had few common values or perspectives, it would be very difficult for them to reach agreements on particular issues. In contemporary America, some elements of the socialization process tend to produce differences in outlook, whereas others promote similarities. The agents of socialization that shape political beliefs are the family of social networks, social groups, and race, political party affiliation, education, and political environment. The family and social network. Most people acquire their initial orientation to politics from their family. As might be expected, differences in family background tend to produce divergent political perspective. Although relatively few parents spend much time directly teaching their children about politics, political conversations occur in many households, and children tend to absorb the political views of parents and other caregivers, often without realizing it. Studies find, for example, that political party preferences are initially acquired at home. Children raised in households in which the primary caregiver are Democrats tend to become Democrats, whereas children raised in homes where their caregivers are Republicans tend to favor the Republican Party. Similarly, children reared in politically liberal household are more likely than not to develop a liberal outlook, whereas children raised in politically conservative settings are likely to see the world through conservative lenses. Family, friends, co-worker, and neighbors are an important source of political orientation for nearly everyone. Online social networks such as Facebook and Twitter likely increase the role of peers in shaping public opinion. One example of the influence of social networks on opinion is the widely shared Facebook meme of an equal sign against a red background used to symbolize support for same-sex marriage rights. Many individuals change their profile pictures on Facebook to this symbol of marriage equality in June 2013, when the Supreme Court was deciding two cases concerning same-sex marriage. This social media discussion was associated with upticks in public support for gay marriage rights nationally. Social groups and race. Another important source of political value is the social groups to which individuals belong. Social groups include those to which individuals belong involuntarily, national, religious, gender, and racial groups, for example, and those they join willingly, such as political parties, labor unions, and military, and environmental, educational, and occupational groups. Group memberships give individuals experience and perspective that shape their views of political and social life. Among the most important of these is race. In American society, for example, the experience of blacks and whites can differ significantly. Blacks are a minority and have been victims of persecution and discrimination throughout American history. Blacks and whites also have different occupational opportunities, often live in separate communities, and may attend separate schools. Such differences tend to produce distinctive political outlooks. For example, data from CNN, Gallup, and the Pew Center shows that blacks and whites differ considerably in their perception of the extent of racism in America. Indeed, according to another CNN poll, 47% of whites respondents thought racism fairly or very common, while almost 49% thought it was rare in the United States. Among African Americans, on the other hand, fully 86% thought racism was common and only 12% said it was rare, almost a 40-point difference between blacks and whites. Interestingly, Hispanic Americans who have also been victims of racism in the United States are less likely than African Americans to see America as a racist society. In 2008 survey, 52% of Hispanic Americans and 55% of white Americans said that race relations in the United States was generally good. Only 29% of black Americans agreed. Men and women have important differences of opinion as well, reflecting differences in social roles and occupational patterns. Women tend to oppose military intervention more than men, are more likely than men to favor policies to protect the environment, and are more likely to support government, social, and health care programs. Perhaps because of these differences on issues, women are more likely than men to vote for Democratic candidates. This tendency of men's and women's opinion to differ is known as the gender gap. Table 5.1 shows that across different policy areas, men and women's opinions vary fairly consistently by about 10 points. Party affiliation, political party membership, or loyalty is one of the most important factors affecting political orientation. We can think of partisanship as red tinting, referring to the Republican Party, or blue tinted, referring to the Democratic Party. Glasses that color opinion on vast array of issues. Partisanship tends to rely on party leaders and the media for cues on the appropriate position to take on major political issues. Walter Lippmann, an influential political commentator on the mid-20th century, argued that public opinion is but an echo of elite positions on policy issues, and many others studying public opinion agree. According to recent studies, differences between Democratic and Republican partisans on a variety of political and policy questions are greater today than during any other period for which data are available. On issues of national security, for example, Republicans have become very hawkish, whereas Democrats have become quite dovish. And in October 2003 survey, 85% of Republicans, but only 39% of Democrats thought that Americans' war against Iraq was a good idea. Gaps on social and economic issues are just as broad. Some refer to the ever-widening chasm between the parties as the politics of extremism. An example is the showdown between congressional Republicans and Democrats over federal budgets and whether to raise the national debt ceiling, legal permission for government to borrow more money to pay its obligation. The Republicans insisted on cuts in President Obama's Affordable Care Act. Democrats refused. This clash led to the shutdown of the federal government for 2 weeks in 2013.